I used to believe my life was the kind people secretly envied, the kind that looked stable from the outside and felt earned from the inside, built from years of early mornings, late nights, and a stubborn refusal to quit when things got hard. My name is Adrian Mercer, and at 44 I thought I finally understood the shape of success, not as a shiny trophy but as a rhythm. Open the eyes before dawn, run a few miles to keep the stress from settling in my bones, check on the 3 casual dining spots I'd built from nothing but a food truck and a loan I was still half afraid of, and come home to a house that smelled like coffee and toast and familiarity. My wife, Leela, was 38 and expecting a baby, her second but what I believed would be our first together, and I had long convinced myself that this late chapter of our story would be the calm, generous one, the part where the work paid off and the chaos quieted down. Her son from a previous marriage, Noah, was 20 and studying business administration at a local college, while my daughter, Mara, had just turned 17 and had mastered that particular blend of eye-rolling sarcasm and unexpected tenderness that only teenagers seem to perfect. From the street, our place looked like every other neat home on a quiet block, trimmed hedges, lights on at dinner, a car in the driveway, and I wore that normality like armor, because after years of scraping by, normal felt like a victory. I told myself that stability was proof of wisdom, that predictability meant safety, and that love, once secured, stayed put the way a well-built wall stays standing, even if you stop checking the mortar. I had no idea how quickly a wall can crack when pressure starts working from the inside. Running restaurants teaches you to notice small things, the pause before an answer, the way someone avoids eye contact, the shift in posture that says more than words ever will, and those instincts had kept me from making 1,000 small mistakes over the years, from trusting the wrong supplier to ignoring a cook who'd started cutting corners. About 3 months before everything collapsed, those same instincts began tapping at the back of my skull, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to keep me from fully relaxing. Leela started changing in ways that were easy to explain and even easier to excuse. She'd silence her phone and flip it face down when I entered a room. She'd answer simple questions with vague half-smiles, and she'd leave the house with explanations that sounded rehearsed but incomplete. I told myself pregnancy could do strange things to a person, that exhaustion could make anyone distant, that mood swings weren't a sign of betrayal but just biology playing its rough games. We'd been through pregnancy before, and I remembered the tears over nothing, the sudden cravings, the days when silence felt safer than conversation. Still, something about this felt different, not louder or more obvious, but quieter in a way that made my chest feel tight, like standing in a room where the air had been slowly leaking out. Leela had always been a talker, the kind of person who narrated her day, who complained about traffic, about Noah's laundry habits, about Mara's music choices, and suddenly she was guarding her hours like secrets, answering with shrugs and changing the subject with a skill that felt practiced. I didn't want to become a man who searched drawers or checked messages, because I believed trust was either whole or useless, but I also knew that ignoring a warning sign doesn't make it disappear. It just gives it more time to grow teeth. The night everything broke open started as nothing special, just another long shift that was supposed to stretch past closing, because one of my locations had lost 2 cooks to the flu, and the dinner rush had turned into controlled chaos. I'd gone in expecting to be there until nearly midnight, sleeves rolled up, helping wherever I could, but a few quick calls and a couple of favors owed to managers at my other places solved the crisis faster than I expected, and for once I found myself driving home while the streets were still busy instead of empty. On a whim, I stopped for takeout from a small Italian place Leela loved, imagining her surprise, imagining the small smile she'd give me when I walked in earlier than planned, imagining the normal evening I thought I was returning to. The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway, which wasn't strange by itself, because she'd been going to bed early, saying the pregnancy drained her energy. but the darkness felt heavier than usual, like a blanket pulled too tight. When I opened the door and called out, my voice echoed back at me, and that echo settled in my stomach like a stone. The living room was neat, the kitchen clean, too clean for a house with a teenager, and when I went upstairs, I found Mara's room empty, her bed untouched. That was the moment when unease became fear, because routine had vanished without leaving a note. I checked my phone, expecting a message, a missed call, something that explained the silence, but there was nothing. And Leela had always been the kind of person who over-communicated, not under. Standing in that quiet hallway, I felt like I'd walked into the wrong version of my own life. I wish I could say I acted calmly and wisely, but the truth is I did something I'd promised myself I'd never do, something that felt like crossing a line I'd drawn with pride. I opened her laptop. It was still logged in, still warm, as if it had been waiting for me, and the first thing that filled the screen was not an email or a shopping list, but a series of bright, careless photos that made my pulse slam in my ears. It was a party, clearly not the quiet dinner she'd mentioned earlier that day, and the people in the pictures were strangers to me, faces flushed, glasses raised, lights too bright for comfort. And there in the middle of it all was Layla, my pregnant wife, laughing with her arm around a man I'd never seen, his hand resting in a place that felt far too familiar. I scrolled, each movement of my finger heavier than the last, and found more images, short videos, moments captured without thought for consequences. Leela dancing, Leela holding what looked unmistakably like a drink, Leela leaning into conversations that didn't look innocent. The comments below were worse, casual words that felt like knives, friends joking about how wild she'd been, someone teasing about a man named Rowan who couldn't look away, someone else mentioning a pool and how shocked her husband would be if he knew. My hands were shaking, not just from anger but from the sudden collapse of certainty, and I started saving everything, not because I wanted ammunition, but because I was afraid my memory would try to soften it later. The front door opened while I was still staring at the screen, and I barely had time to close the laptop and pretend to be focused on a magazine I hadn't actually read. Leela walked in carrying her shoes, her hair damp, her makeup smeared in a way that told a story she hadn't planned to tell me, and for a second I couldn't reconcile the woman in front of me with the woman in those photos, as if I were looking at two versions of the same person, and neither one was complete. She smiled when she saw me, surprised, and said something about me being home early, and I asked her as evenly as I could where she'd been. There was a pause, small but real, the kind you only notice when you're already listening for it, and then she gave me a neat answer about being out with friends, about dinner, about nothing special. I told her what I'd seen, not shouting, not accusing, just stating facts that felt like broken glass in my mouth, and watched the color drain from her face before she tried to turn it around on me, asking how I could invade her privacy, how I could spy on her. I told her privacy doesn't include lying, and that one glass of wine becomes a bigger issue when there's a child involved, and that just a friend is a phrase people use when they don't want to explain something more complicated. The argument wasn't loud, but it was sharp, full of edges, and when she tried to walk past me, I stood in her way, not to threaten, just to make it clear that running from the conversation wasn't an option. When she insisted it was nothing, that I was overreacting, I heard myself say words I'd never planned to say, words that felt cruel and necessary at the same time, about going to the doctor, about getting a full checkup, about needing proof that the child she was carrying was mine. The room went very still after that, as if even the walls were waiting to see what she'd do next, and she looked at me like I'd shattered something that couldn't be repaired. Before either of us could say more, the front door opened again and Noah came in, stopping short when he saw us standing there like two people who'd forgotten how to share the same space. I asked him if he knew about the party, not to drag him into it, but because I needed to understand how far the silence went, and he admitted she'd mentioned going out, nothing more. When I asked about the drinking and the man in the photos, he looked at the floor, and Leela told him to go upstairs, her voice sharp with panic. I told her this concerned him too, because families don't exist in separate compartments, and when you crack one wall, the whole house feels it. The look on Noah's face, that mix of confusion and disappointment, did more damage than any argument could have. The next morning felt unreal, like walking through a familiar place after a fire, everything still standing but wrong in ways you can't ignore. Leela acted as if nothing had happened, making coffee, moving around the kitchen with forced normality, and I told her we were going to see Dr. Hale, that we were getting a full prenatal exam and a paternity test. The mug slipped from her hand and shattered, coffee spreading across the floor like a dark stain, and she stared at me as if I'd announced the end of the world instead of a medical appointment. I told her I needed certainty, not because I wanted to hurt her, but because trust, once cracked, demands proof before it can even pretend to heal. She said the test would destroy us, and I told her we were already standing in the wreckage, that tests don't create disasters, they just reveal them. Noah hovered in the doorway, unsure where to stand, and suggested counseling, and I told him gently that we were past the point where talking without facts could fix anything. When Leela finally agreed, there was a flicker in her eyes that wasn't anger or sadness but fear, and that flicker stayed with me all the way to the clinic. The waiting room was full of couples who looked like they belonged there, hands linked, conversations low and hopeful, and I felt like an intruder in a story I once thought was mine. Leela said it was humiliating to have to prove herself, and I said it was humiliating to find out the truth through pictures meant for strangers. Dr. Hale was calm and professional, explaining procedures, showing us the ultrasound, pointing out a healthy heartbeat that under different circumstances might have made me cry with joy instead of sit in silence like a juror. The test itself was simple, almost anticlimactic, a reminder that life-changing moments don't always announce themselves with drama, and when we left, we didn't talk, not because there was nothing to say but because everything felt too heavy to carry in words. The days that followed stretched thin and sharp, our house filled with quiet that wasn't peaceful, Mara watching us with worried eyes, Noah spending more time away, and Leela moving through rooms like a guest who didn't know how long she was allowed to stay. When Mara finally asked me what was wrong, I told her the truth in pieces, careful not to turn her into a weapon, and showed her the photos, and saw something harden in her expression that I wished she'd never had to grow. When the results came in, Dr. Hale told us the child was mine, and relief and grief collided in my chest in a way I hadn't known was possible. Leela cried, saying this proved everything was fine, that we could move on, and I realized how differently we defined fine. Because even with biology settled, the lies were still there, the messages I'd found later were still there, the quiet confessions to another man about feeling trapped, about wanting to be understood, about meeting again in secret were still there, and those words felt heavier than any photograph. I told her I was done, not with being a father, but with being a husband to someone who'd chosen to step outside our marriage long before she stepped into that party. She begged, offered counseling, promised change, and I told her some things don't break loudly, they break in ways that leave you standing in the middle of the pieces, knowing you can't rebuild the same shape. Walking out of that office, I felt older and clearer at the same time, as if certainty always charges interest. 6 months later, I signed papers in a quiet office while rain tapped against the windows, and thought about how strange it is that endings are often so administrative. The restaurants were still doing well, maybe better, because I could focus without second-guessing every late night or unexplained silence. Mara stood by me in ways that made me proud and sad all at once. Noah started his own life, and Leela and I worked out custody, learning to speak in short, careful sentences instead of arguments. When my son was born, I held him and felt a fierce, uncomplicated love that reminded me why I'd fought for clarity in the first place. I don't tell this story because it's dramatic, and I don't tell it because I want sympathy. I tell it because I learned that stability isn't something you assume, it's something you protect, And sometimes protecting it means walking away from the version of your life you thought you were supposed to keep. I'm still learning, still building, still figuring out how to be the kind of man my children can respect. And some nights are quieter than I'd planned, but they're honest, and that turns out to be worth more than comfort. The weeks after the papers were signed settled into a strange kind of routine, the sort that feels temporary even when you know it might last for years, because every object in the house still remembered a different version of your life. I moved through rooms that echoed with old conversations, cooked meals that tasted like effort instead of comfort, and learned that silence can be both a relief and a weight. My son, whom I named Elias, became the anchor in all that uncertainty, not because he fixed anything, but because holding him reminded me that some responsibilities don't care about your emotional wreckage. They just exist and demand that you show up. Leela and I developed a careful truce, a schedule written more in unspoken rules than on paper, and every exchange felt like walking across thin ice that might crack if either of us put too much emotion into a sentence. I watched her try to rebuild her own life, taking on work she'd never planned to do, adjusting to smaller spaces and tighter budgets, and I felt something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite anger, more like a distant recognition that choices have shadows that follow you long after the moment passes. Mara took on a quiet maturity that both impressed and worried me, helping with her brother without being asked, asking questions that weren't really about homework or curfews, but about whether people can actually change, or if they just learn to hide their worst parts better. And I tried to answer honestly without turning my pain into her burden. Work became my refuge in ways it hadn't been before, not because I wanted to escape home, but because I needed a place where problems had clear shapes and solutions, where a broken freezer or a late delivery could be fixed with action instead of conversations that went in circles. I found myself spending more time on the floor with my staff, not as a boss checking boxes, but as someone who remembered what it felt like to build something from nothing and lose something you thought was permanent. A few of my managers noticed the change and told me I seemed calmer, more focused, and I realized they were right, not because life had become easier, but because uncertainty had been replaced by difficult truths, and those, at least, don't pretend to be something else. Late nights were still part of the job, but now when I came home, I knew exactly why the house was quiet, and that knowledge, however lonely, was better than the old gnawing suspicion that had once lived in my chest like a second heart. I started running again, not for fitness, but for the way the rhythm of my breath could drown out the noise in my head. And sometimes I'd push the pace just to remind myself that exhaustion earned on your own terms feels different from exhaustion forced on you by someone else's choices. Co-parenting turned out to be its own education, a lesson in restraint and precision, in choosing words that didn't reopen wounds and setting boundaries that protected the children without turning them into messengers or shields. Leela and I disagreed often, sometimes about schedules, sometimes about what counted as discipline or freedom, and each disagreement carried the ghost of our old arguments. But we learned, slowly and awkwardly, to keep those ghosts out of the room. Elias grew fast, the way Bobbies always do, as if they're racing toward some invisible finish line, and every new sound or expression felt like a small promise that life keeps moving even when you prefer to sit still for a while. Mara took to him with a seriousness that surprised me, holding him as if he were something fragile and important at the same time, and I saw in her a version of strength that doesn't need to announce itself. Noah visited sometimes, polite and distant, building a life that didn't orbit around our mistakes, and I respected that, even if part of me wished things were simple enough for him to just be a kid again. There was a day, months later, when I ran into the man from the photos in a grocery store aisle, a coincidence so ordinary it felt almost scripted, and he looked older than I remembered, or maybe just smaller without the context of betrayal to make him loom larger. He tried to apologize, said he hadn't known the full story at first, said things had been complicated, and I realized how tired I was of explanations that arrive after damage is done. I told him calmly that he didn't owe me anything and that whatever story he told himself was his to live with, and I walked away feeling lighter, not because I'd won something, but because I didn't need that conversation to mean more than it did. Closure, I learned, isn't a dramatic moment where everything makes sense. It's the quiet decision to stop carrying someone else's unfinished business. As the seasons shifted, I started to notice small changes in myself, the way I listened more carefully, the way I asked questions instead of assuming answers, the way I could sit in a room alone without feeling like I was being punished. Friends tried to set me up on dates, and I thanked them but said no, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to be certain that whatever came next wouldn't be built on distraction or fear of being alone. I watched Mara prepare for graduation, heard her talk about plans that stretched far beyond our street and our history, and felt a pride that had nothing to do with success and everything to do with resilience. Some nights, after putting Elias to bed, I'd sit in the quiet and think about how quickly certainty can become memory, and how memory, if you let it, can become either a chain or a map, depending on how you choose to read it. There were still hard days, days when a song or a smell or a random photo online would bring back the version of my life that no longer existed, and I'd have to remind myself that missing something doesn't mean you should go back to it. Leela and I never became friends, but we became something like respectful strangers with shared responsibilities, and that, I decided, was enough. She found her footing in her own way, and I stopped measuring her progress against my pain, because doing that only kept me tied to a story I was trying to finish. The restaurants expanded again, not dramatically, not recklessly, just carefully. The way you build when you've learned that growth without stability is just another form of risk. And I started mentoring a few younger owners, not because I had all the answers, but because I'd learned that mistakes become useful when you're honest about them. One afternoon, Mara asked me if I was happy, not in the casual way people ask about the weather, but in the careful way someone asks when they're trying to understand their own future by looking at yours. I told her the truth, that happiness isn't a constant state, it's more like a series of moments you learn to notice, and that right now, my life had more honest moments than it used to, even if some of them were quieter than I'd imagined. She nodded, as if filing that away for later, and I realized that parenting, like everything else, is less about giving perfect answers and more about showing what it looks like to live with imperfect ones. Time did what it always does, smoothing some edges, sharpening others, and I found myself less interested in proving anything and more interested in building something that could last without pretending to be unbreakable. Elias took his first steps, then his first clumsy runs, and every small milestone felt like a reminder that beginnings don't ask permission from endings. They just arrive and demand your attention. I started taking photos again, not for social media or announcements, but for myself, to remember that life isn't only defined by its worst chapters, even if those chapters change the way you read the rest of the book. There are still people who ask me if I regret how things ended, and I tell them regret is the wrong word, because regret assumes there was a version of events where everyone stayed the same and nothing hurt, and I don't think that version ever really existed. What I do have is clarity, and clarity is a quieter companion than hope, but a more reliable one. I know now that trust isn't something you set and forget. It's something you maintain with actions, and that respect, especially for yourself, is the foundation that keeps everything else from shifting when pressure builds. Some evenings, after the house is quiet and the work emails are done, I sit on the porch and listen to the neighborhood settle, and I think about how strange it is that a life can look so stable right up until the moment it isn't, and how brave it can be to admit that stability was borrowed, not owned. I don't pretend the story made me wiser in every way, but it did teach me to pay attention, to value truth over comfort, and to understand that starting over isn't a failure, it's a decision. I'm still Adrian Mercer, still building, still learning, still making mistakes and fixing what I can, And I no longer measure my life by how closely it matches an old picture in my head. I measure it by how honestly I can live inside it, how well I can show up for my children, and how willing I am to walk away from anything that asks me to shrink myself just to keep it intact. And that, I've learned, is a kind of success no one can take from you once you've claimed it.